the Civilian Conservation Corps, or Roosevelt's Tree Army, was formed in 1933, and in 2008 it celebrated its 75th anniversary. The program began when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was inaugurated president, and it is arguably one of his more successful programs to find work for people in the Depression. When Roosevelt was inaugurated as president on March the 4th, 1933, the country was mired in what became known as the Great Depression. About 25% of the working population was unemployed, and many more, perhaps an equal number, were underemployed. FDR promised Americans a New Deal, and he acted quickly to implement many aspects of his plan. By March 21st, he had formulated and announced a plan to create a Civilian Conservation Corps. FDR stated, "I propose to create a Civilian Conservation Corps to be used in simple work, not interfering with normal employment, and confining itself to forestry, the prevention of soil erosion, flood control, and similar projects. I call your attention to the fact that this type of work is of definite practical value, not only through the prevention of great financial loss, but as a means of creating future national wealth." The CCC was arguably one of the New Deal's greatest successes, both for its humanitarianism and its results in landscape and recreational development. It was administered by a cooperative effort of the Departments of War, Agriculture, Interior, and Labor. By March 23rd, the plan was introduced to Congress and approved. The first recruits in the country were enrolled by April 7th. On June 23rd, work began on Camp 657 at Summit Lake in Langlade County. All camps were run in a military style. Recruits had to pass a physical, lined up for inspection, and trained as in the Army. In fact, the CCCs were also known as Roosevelt's Tree Army. Numbers varied with time, but in 1935, at its peak, the CCC had 4,000 camps throughout the country with 500,000 enrollees. Most were young, unemployed men aged 15 to 25, but there were also significant numbers of unemployed World War II veterans. One recruit in an interview in 1985 said, "The years weren't very much different from one another. They weren't children whose parents had already slated them for Harvard, Princeton, Wisconsin, Northwestern. These were parents who didn't know what to do with the boys when they finished high school. They were just another eater at home. They couldn't find a job." Camps were spread throughout the U.S. More than 4,000 had been established by 1942. In Wisconsin, the average number of camps at any one time was 54. During its heyday of operations from 1933 to 1942, over 75,000 Wisconsin men found employment in the CCCs. Recruits were paid $30 a month. $25 of that was sent home to the family. I've spoken to families who say that if it hadn't been for that $25 a month coming home, they might have lost the family farm or the home. Recruits had the remaining $5 a month left for spending money at the canteen. Recruits worked a regular 40-hour week. And for many of the recruits, they received better medical care, better food, and some job training which they would not have done had they stayed at home. One of the first camps established was at Summit Lake. It was established in 1933, one of the first camps to be established, and continued to run until 1942. Camp 657 started at Summit Lake and later moved to Otter Lake in Elcho. The life at Camp 657 was typical of all other camps. There were about 200 men in the camp, many from the area, but some from other parts of the state, and a few from other states. One man, Peter Jaglat, told me that between his salary and that of his two brothers, who were also in the CCCs, between those three, they were able to save the family farm. The camp originated in Summit Lake in 1933 with the recruits living in tents. The plan was to build a more permanent barracks in Elcho at Otter Lake, but they weren't complete until November. The more permanent camps housed the recruits and these permanent barracks were built in the summer of '33 and were also the headquarters for some 16 smaller camps to the north and east of Elcho. In November 1933, on November 27th, the recruits marched in military formation from Summit Lake to their new camp, having already endured a number of below-freezing nights living in their tents. A typical workday consisted of reveille at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30, loading of the trucks with men and materials by 7:15, and then off to a work site. There was a 30-minute lunch break at noon, then back to camp by 4 p.m., then the flag lowering, inspection, and dinner at 5 p.m. The lights out were at 10 p.m. Between dinner and lights out, there were classes for those completing their education and some recreational activities. The camps were run in a military style with Army officers heading the camp. Reveille at 6 a.m. Camp 657, like the other camps, had its own insignias, and again military style. A handbook was given to the recruits describing their duties, their responsibilities, and opportunities for further study. There was also advice on how to behave socially with the local people, particularly young women, just as was found in the Army manuals. In some cases, specific training could lead to certification for employment. An interesting story developed when a fire broke out at the barbecue pit at Craftwood Gardens, the summer home of the Kraft family, who operated Kraft Cheese. The fire threatened to get out of control and a CCC crew was called in. J.L. Kraft was so impressed by the work of the crew that he hired the crew chief to work at Kraft. He went on to become the head of engineering for all of Kraft Foods. When a recruit found employment, he received an official discharge from the CCCs. These are views of the camp and the barracks. Here's a certificate for somebody who had completed a landscaping course. The Camp 657 in Langlade County, during its first 4 years of existence, for which we have records, completed a number of things that improved the general area. They planted trees, fought forest fires, established lookout towers and fire roads, erected telephone lines, and stocked lake with fish. Within 4 years of its establishment, the Elcho camp completed this list of items. They spent a total of 4,800 hours in forest fire fighting. The barracks were right on the edge of the lake, Otter Lake in Elcho. Here we see the machine shop. Many recruits learned a trade while working here. Specific manuals were for various tasks, dealing with the forest truck trails, trail establishment, auto mechanics, fish stream improvement. These are just some of the specific manuals and training programs that were offered. Here's a work crew out at the gravel pit. Work crews doing some lake fish stocking and forestry improvement. Camp Susan in Langlade County was a CCC project, and here is the crew establishing some of the buildings at Camp Susan. Here's a logging truck, and you can see that the CCCs had their own license plates, as you can see on this truck. And here's a CCC license plate. You can also notice that it was run by the military, and it was actually part of the War Department. This is a photo taken of firefighting equipment in the Rhinelander Museum devoted to the CCCs. The men lived military style in bunkhouses. Here's one. Here's another bunkhouse. And the mess hall. When Prohibition was repealed, the recruits were already in their bunks in Otter Lake, and each recruit was given a bottle of beer. Nobody asked questions about age. The kitchen, where Meals were prepared for the recruits, also served as training area for people who were learning how to cook. And there were recreational facilities such as this pool hall, ping pong table, and a bar, and a general reading area where some of the recruits were sitting and studying at night to complete their high school education or special training classes. Here's some memorabilia from the CCC camp at Elcho, the insignia patch, and their own matchbooks. Ed Drab left his family farm in Rolling Township, just south of Antigo, to enroll in Camp 657. When he left, his sister knit him a sweater and made him a pillowcase. He told me that one of his first tasks was to climb the tower and do some work up there. He recalled that he got about halfway up the tower and then looked down. He froze. One of the officers had to climb up and talk him down. In spite of the humiliation of this first day on the job, which he vividly remembers, even though he's now in his 90s, he still feels that the CCC days were very worthwhile and some of the best of his life. Harold Ritke, another man who was in the CCC camp at Elcho, wrote that he was an Antigo High School graduate in 1940 and there was nothing for him to do after graduation. He enrolled in the CCCs. One of his tasks, and that of some of his workers, was to go through the woods flushing out deer. This was one of the earliest attempts in Wisconsin at trying to establish estimates of deer population as part of a program of wildlife management. It was not all work. There was recreation also. And here are boxing matches. In addition, there were sports teams formed that competed against other CCC camps and local high school teams. Here's a baseball game. Basketball. And a football team. There's an interesting story about this football team. They called themselves the Packers and wrote to the champion Green Bay Packers asking for some old uniforms. It wasn't long before a large box arrived in Elcho, compliments of Coach Lambeau and all the lads. The pads were too large for most of these young CCC boys, but they made do. One of the boys insisted on being made captain, even though he played center and kicked extra points in high school. His argument was that he had Curly Lambeau's own uniform. Team members who had come from Green Bay were also advising the coach because they felt that after seeing the real Green Bay Packers playing in Green Bay, they knew what plays to call. The story of the camp receiving uniforms from the Green Bay team made the Antigo Daily Journal. The camp also formed a musical band to entertain the groups and would also be granted leave to go to town to socialize with town folks and play at dances. That's where they had the opportunity to meet women. Here are some official discharge papers for one of the recruits. When a CCC recruit received employment elsewhere, the Elcho band, the camp band, saw them off at the Elcho train station with a little musical serenade. Recruits were able to go to town. They would meet women. Here's a little skating party on Otter Lake. The camp published its own newspaper. Originally it was called the Woodchopper, but then later they revised it, spruced it up a little bit, and it became the Elcho Eagle. And here you can see some of the stories about how Antigo is cooperating with the CCC camp in letting them use the high school gym for basketball. They had an advice column, and here's some advice that this woman is offering to the CCC recruits. She says, "A million girls have their eyes on the CCC. No doubt she means those CCC boys who take an interest in their job and leave it as a task well done. Here and there you may hear of deprivations committed by the enrollees of the Civilian Conservation Corps, but those are exceptions to the rule. As a whole, the CCC boys are clean-minded, honest Americans from the best homes. The American girl with her eyes on the CCC knows what she is about. She knows that the youths enrolled there have been taught self-reliance, thrift, and honest work." Here's another advice column supposedly written by Aunt Tilly. And somebody writes in, "My partner and I have been taking some terrible beatings from Lieutenant Reardon and Mr. Herman in the pool. As soon as we get 57 points, one of them runs the table. I get so angry that I chew the tips off the cues. What would you suggest, Auntie?" Another one writes, "My girl has got the timber itch, and I'm afraid to hug her because they say that it is contagious, and I don't want to catch it. I don't know if it is catching, but it looks like hell, and you know, Auntie, that a fellow who has a pretty face like mine don't want to mark it up." So it was a lot of fun, but there was some serious news in there about the life of the CCC camp and life in other camps and what was going on in the community. The Elcho Eagle won second place in a national contest of CCC newspapers. In Wisconsin alone, the CCC over the course of its history employed over 92,000 men, 75,000 of which were from Wisconsin. It dispersed $16 million in payroll. The average number of camps in Wisconsin at any one time was 54. They accomplished a number of things, not only in Langlade County, but throughout the state, in terms of bridges, telephone lines, truck trails, forest firefighting, and also they were instrumental in establishing a lot of the state parks, such as the one at Devil's Lake, that we still enjoy today. The National Youth Association was another New Deal program that did defense work once the U.S. entered World War II. With the U.S. entry into World War II, many CCC recruits entered the military or did defense work, and gradually the CCCs were phased out. By 1942, they had ceased to exist. But their history continues. In 1983, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the establishment of the CCC, the Christmas tree for the Capitol in Washington, D.C. was taken from a former CCC camp in the Chequamegon National Forest near Fife Field. This page comes from the National Association of CCC Alumni. In 1990, a plaque was erected on Otter Lake near Elcho to commemorate the existence of the CCC camp there. Many of the CCC barracks buildings and shops were taken down. For a brief period of time after World War II, one was used as a boat manufacturing company. And then a couple of the barracks houses were picked up and moved and used as cottages, such as the one you see here at Bass Lake. And, oh, this one is at Enterprise Lake, and there was one at Bass Lake as well. After the CCCs, some of the philosophy lived on. In 1983, the Wisconsin Conservation Corps was formed to further the goals of the CCC. They did a lot of forestry work, environmental work, but there were two main differences that over what had happened with the CCCs. The recruits lived at home rather than in barracks, and women recruits were also accepted. This would have made Eleanor Roosevelt proud, for she wanted women to be included in the CCCs. Much of the material and photographs you see here was donated to the museum, the Langley County Historical Society Museum, by three people. Phil Beck, whose father-in-law was in the CCCs, Ed Drab, who himself was in the CCC camp, and Ken McNinch, whose grandfather, Ken Elliott, was in the CCC camp in Elcho. We also like to thank the Rhinelander Museum for the CCCs for some of their material.